Everybody, good morning. Welcome, thank you. I'm not a very loud talker, so. All right, good to see everybody this morning. As you've probably figured out, because you have eyes, that I'm alone up here this morning. Jeff is gone. I'm scared. Today we're talking about marriage. Does anybody want to come help? No, I see lots of seasoned veterans out there saying no, sir. So that gives me a lot of hope. So, anyways, though, it is an important topic because we can glean a lot of things from it. So, anyways, we're gonna roll through this together. I'm a little stopped up this morning, as Vaughn mentioned he was too. I could tell it definitely was a bass-centric church this morning. Could feel the bass. Probably if cars were driving by, the church building was just like rattling. Because that was supposed to be a joke. But I'm stopped up as well, so hopefully I don't sniffle too much, so apologies if we do. So anyways, we're going to be, as we talked about last week, we continued on with some earthly citizenship submission that we had and submitting to authorities there. We had a good discussion of that towards the end. So we're going to roll on now, and we're going to change gears a little bit, and we're talking about an authority, but we're kind of delving into the spiritual thing. And so today we're titling this, It Takes Two, because it does take two. So quick quiz, anybody give me a song title, It Takes Two? Yeah, Rob Bass and DJ Easy Rock. All right, I mean, naturally that's like what we think of, right? Maybe go old school, like some Marvin Gaye, It Takes Two. And who sang that with him? Anybody remember? We don't have cell phone service in here, so we can't Google that. But anyways, yeah. So It Takes Two. When I read that title, that just popped into my head, and I thought it does take two. And so we're going to look at a little bit of why it does take two. So let's see. Let's get into this here. So as we move on today's discussion, we have our responsibilities in our homes with our families, and of course, that is the spiritual sphere. So the first question I want to start with is this. So how is it that one may have a harder time with spiritual fellowship and leadership in the family and church sphere versus the earthly citizenship sphere? So how are those two authorities different, and why may we have one? Why may it be for one to have a harder time with the spiritual sphere versus the earthly citizenship sphere? Yeah.
When we do wrong, there's a consequence. There's the police officer. There's, the boss at work. Those kinds of things that we get immediate kind of feedback. But yet spiritually, we can go along and we may suffer some troubles because of our sins. But God's not here taking. It's kind of like if you don't eat right and you don't take care of yourself, a long way down the road you may get diabetes, but it may not affect your behavior when you're younger because It's so far off. And I think we think that way with spirituality as well, that we've got a long time till we, give an account, so to speak.
Sure, absolutely. Well, it's because of the this sphere that we're talking about. I say sphere. This sphere that we're talking about today with the family and church. And I think it's different because it's voluntary, right? We've been talking about submitting earthly citizenship. And so what happens, you're right, what happens whenever you break the law? In some serious ways, you're fined, you go to jail. What happens with your boss whenever you break that authority? If it's bad enough, like what happens? Like you find yourself on the street or a new job. The boss says, don't watch baseball in your office on the second monitor while you're trying to get spreadsheets done. So that's why I work from home. So that doesn't matter. But really, it's that voluntary aspect that falls into it. And so as we discussed in earlier series, obedience in the face of overwhelming force may not indicate true submission and therefore might not require as much faith, right? So most of us, authorities in the church and within our marriages, are not backed by force. that can compel obedience. So in this case, followership is a true choice and is the ultimate faith in God trust. And so as we get into talking about the marriage relationship within the home, relationships at church, I think that's where this one pops up. And I think this is where Satan is a true gamesman in this area right here. This is, I think, where he finds his really fertile ground. Because if you really think about it, why does Satan have so much success in these areas that we're talking about today?
Part of it is, I guess, what I would classify as selfishness, and kind of related to your prior question, I think of, at work, somebody else is in charge. At a lot of other places, other people are in charge. And we kind of see home like, okay, now I can be in charge. Mm-hmm. And that's the selfish aspect. And so it's easy prey for Satan to, when I already have this thought that I want to be in charge, to work on us.
Sure. Absolutely.
Well, a lot of it is we're lazy sometimes because we don't do Ephesians 6.
Right.
Paul commands us to put on the full armor of God every day, not just once a week, but every day, and be prepared for the devil's schemes. Well, that ought to tell us real quick that he's scheming against us, and we ought to be aware of that all the time and put on the full armor of God every day.
Sure. Absolutely. Because what is the ultimate thing that is, I guess if you call it our root original sin as human beings in relation to God, what is that? What's like our original root sin? Disobedience, right? Rebelling from the authority of God. And so if you look back at Satan, what did he do? What is his MO? What got him kicked out of heaven, right? He rebels. He says, I want to overthrow this thing. I want to have a coup. I know the way to do this. And so he convinces Eve that I know that this is, if you want the knowledge, if you want to know and have the authority and your eyes opened and see as God does and be basically your own God, then I have the path for that. So this is why he's so good at it, is because he knows rebellion. It's his own thing. And so in relation, whenever we do things, as we're going to talk about our roles in marriages and how those relate to our roles in the church and our roles with each other and our roles outside the church, whenever we have problems in these areas, it's because essentially we're not submitting anymore like we should. And we'll go through a list of submitting things. But I think that's why the devil is so good for it, because all these things that we do in the sphere of marriage, in the spiritual spheres that we're looking at, they're all voluntary, right? There's nothing that can compel us necessarily if we do something wrong that we're ultimately going to be punished right then and there, like a jail time or any type of earthly citizenship, authority punishment like we have. That's why it's so tricky, and that's, I think, why the devil is so good in these areas. And so it's this is a hard one for us. And of course, this is all traced back to a long ago, faraway garden. So before we delve into specifics about followership, let's jump back and dive into this success in these areas of submission. And so we've talked about how submission is power, not weakness, and that submission is for everyone. So just a couple, going back a review of what we talked about before. And this one's going to come up just in a little bit, but submit to one another in fear of Christ, Ephesians 5:21. We submit to God, James 4:7. We submit to government authority. We've talked about that in 1 Peter a couple weeks ago. Submit to employers, 1 Peter 2:18. We talked about that as well. Coming up soon, we'll be talking about, which we only have 2 of these left. We submit to church leadership in Hebrews 13:17. And then as we've all grown up in the family, children must obey their parents, Ephesians 6. And we are all subject to one another. So the submission thing it can be a dirty, tricky word for a lot of people. I think it's one that we have come to know as one that we really fight in the paradox of our world versus the earthly citizenship world that we live in as well. So what does the world say about submission? It's weak. Perfect.
The world says everything about it that Satan says.
Yeah.
It's literally his echo chamber.
Mm-hmm.
That's why it falls in line. Like, Satan's a great deceiver, right? So his whole thing is deception. It's easier for him to deceive people than it is for anyone to convince anyone they've been deceived. And the world says literally the antithesis of what God says.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right, so we've got those things that are kind of against us, what the world is saying about us and how we relate to one another in marriage. So let's go ahead and jump into it. I really wanted to give my Brad Princess Bride impersonation. At this point, I'm gonna hold you guys back from that. No, I'm not gonna do it. No, I'm not gonna do it. Malwedge. See, that was terrible to begin with. I'm not even gonna go any farther. So let's go. I'm not an expert, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn. So marriage, a definition. Marriage is when you agree to spend the rest of your life sleeping in a room that's too warm beside someone who's sleeping in a room that's too cold. That's fact. I don't know. Some of you probably watched kids say the darndest thing back in the day. They've tried to reboot it a few times. My grandpa would be over and we would set us down and we'd tune up old Arc Link letter, and so I always like to look up to see what kids say on things, and so I found a few of these that I thought they're pretty funny. It was kids' thoughts on marriage, and so this is from Kristen, age 10. No person really decides before they grow up who they're going to marry. God decides it all way before, and you get to find out later who you're stuck with. That's pretty good. This is from Alan, age 10. You got to find somebody who likes the same stuff. Like, if you like sports, she should like sports, and she should keep the chips and dip coming. That dude, oh, man. He is in big trouble. Better get it together. But as we know, we do have some marching orders, and Ephesians 5 is the longest section of the New Testament that gives us those. And so those that are married, those that have been to a wedding, just in the religious world within the church, these are ones that we've all heard. It's ones that we studied, or it's ones that are ingrained into us growing up. So we'll be in Ephesians 5, starting in 21 through 34. And since I've talked a lot so far, if somebody wants to go for that would be fantastic. Yeah.
And be subject to one another in fear of Christ. Wives, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ also is the head of the church, he himself being the Savior of the body. But as the church is subject to Christ, so also the wives ought to be to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present himself to the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and blameless. So husbands ought also to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church, because we are members of his body. For this cause a man shall leave his father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is great, but I am speaking with reference to Christ and the church. Nevertheless, let each individual among you also love his own wife, even as himself, and let the wife see to it that she respect her husband.
Awesome, thank you. So a pretty good account there of how we are to love one another in marriage and how we are to live that out. So I know that in this day and age, there's probably a lot of stuff in there that, looking at it from an outside perspective, you would say, what? Like, are we still there in that place? And so as you go through these, you've got, 9.5, 10.5 verses that are directed at the husband in here. You've got about 2.5 that are directed at the wife in this situation. And so there's a lot of stuff in here for the husband. So starting off, husband, be the head, the final decision maker of your wife as Christ is head of the church. 25 and 28, love your wife sacrificially just as Christ loved the church. And as you love your own self. Husbands again, 25 through 27, be the spiritual leader in your home, presenting your wife to Christ. Another one, husbands, live with your wife in an understanding way. Sorry, that was 1 Peter 3:7. And then we start off with wives, actually, in 21. And then we end, and so wives, submit yourself to your own husband as to the Lord. So I think we probably have, I would hope, a pretty good context of relating marriage and to the church here in this, right? Because we're told at the first of this that we are, as husbands, are to love his wife as Christ loved the church. So we understand that, but I know that still there's a lot of things that probably creep in and maybe give a little bit of friction in this. Remember, because this is like a voluntary thing we're in here. So husband and wives typically react, how do husbands and wives typically react to these commands? If you were to say, person, come in here, I'm going to read you something. Like, or even us. When we read these commands, I don't know if you've read these in a while. I had gone over Ephesians 5:21 through 34 in a long time as I was reading through it, and some of the stuff really stuck out to me as well. But how do husband and wives react to these as you hear this stuff?
Focus on what their mate should be doing instead of what they should be doing.
Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's always the tricky one talking about this whenever you got your significant other next to you. You gotta be careful what you say. Yeah.
If you've been to one recently, the language has changed
Yeah?
significantly from, used to, there were verses that you read and there were ones you went to. Now everything's been changed, so the language is a little bit more palatable
Oh.
to both parties.
As a wedding recently.
Come on,
And-
this is 2022. Is this really still?
I know, right? Yeah. That's the tough part, isn't it? It is how much of this is really relevant, because in this followership thing, we've come to the conclusion of two things. While this is us following as a body, it comes down to your personal, are you going to do this or not? Do you believe that that this is the written, inspired book, that everything in it is for us to follow, to believe and be closer to him and be a part of him? Or is this, like you said, is this just a collection of things that are written that apply to people at a certain time? And is this one of those instances? So that's your right. Yeah.
The thought, or the saying, the wisdom of God is foolishness to man, comes to mind.
Yeah.
Because in this day and age, marriage is foolishness to the world.
Yeah.
It's irrelevant. Why do we need to worry about it?
Right. My truth is mine.
Yep.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So this kind of reminds me of what we call in the business world servant leader. And it also reminds me of 20, 30, 40 years ago, a boss was just that. He bossed people around, he or she, usually a male, and said, this is what you're doing, this is how you're doing it. Basically, I call it the sit down and shut up method of management. Well, we've evolved in business to realize a much better way of leading is more like this.
Yeah.
Is caring for your people, truly letting them know you care, nurturing and coaching, and you're not, quote, a boss. Now, there's still some bosses out there, but we've discovered, and this basically outlines it, that it's much better to lead people by getting them to want to follow. And it's the same way here. If you truly love and care, you don't see yourself as a, quote, boss.
Yeah.
It's a partnership, and in business, the best, quote, supervisor is just that, it's a partner.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And so it just reminded me of that evolution that we've had in business, or the aha moment in some cases we've had in business, that the old style of command and control doesn't work very well.
Sure.
Because nobody wants to follow it.
Absolutely.
And I always say in business, if you're a manager and nobody's following, you're just out for a walk.
That's right.
And it's the same way here.
It's a good one. Yeah. Thank you. Agreed.
I tell my people the beatings and floggings shall continue until morale improves.
Remember that one. So normally we go through and we hear, we read through these, and you say, all right, wife, husband, what do you think about this? And usually the woman says, she would say, if he would just be a better leader, I could submit better. And vice versa, right? If she would just listen to the way that I'm leading and directing me, then I would be a better leader of the house, right? So you've got these two conflicting things that are against each other, right? Because again, this is a voluntary thing. We're asking to submit all the time. And as we're getting closer to Father's Day here, usually when we get to Mother's Day, it is and Daryl would probably say this up here too, because he says it, often. It is usually Mother's Day, it's and rightfully so. And dads, it's glad you're here. It's like, we made it. It's like, it's the joke, of and I hate that we've got to that place, because jokes like that can be made, and Daryl brings this point up too, is because I think a lot of times as men in our world, especially today, and we see why are all these problems so bad? Why is things going like the way that they're going? And I think a lot of us would probably agree that we're not quite living up to the standard that we're given here in this verse. And I know that's probably true. For me, a lot of the times, I'm like, why are things not going as well as I think they should? It's because I'm not submitting to these areas like I should. And so I guess we could say it this way: a large portion of the problems in marriage are a direct result of a husband's failure to fulfill his responsibility. So I guess we could say it in a different way. If your wife is not the kind of wife the Bible says that she should be, then most of the time, it's probably our fault. Not all the time, but I think there's a lot of ways that we are not submitting ourselves, men, and this is right back here at me. I'm not being how Christ was for the church, and therefore, I'm probably not the easiest to follow sometimes. So let's jump into some of these verses a little closer. So back to verse 25, which was, let me pull this out real quick. If I went crazy here, okay. Okay, so husband, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by washing with water through the word. So, right there he says to love your wives, just as Christ loved the church. So, men, and I guess all of us in general, this is kind of a general question, even though it's specific maybe to husbands here. or men, do we put conditions on love? You think that's something that's natural for us to do? Or maybe how have our thoughts on love been molded by the world around us?
Well, love has been devalued across the board.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I love cheeseburgers, or I love
Truth.
baseball.
Uh-huh.
I love, insert your example here. And then when you love your wife, is it the same thing?
Yeah.
I guess I always heard growing up that marriage was 50-50. And so I always grew up thinking, hey, if you give your 50, the other person will give their 50. But really, it's 100-100. And so everybody's got to be giving their all the time, looking to the person's needs. They're it's a full circle, not just a half. And so I think that's important.
Yeah.
Like shift in the way we think, the way culture has changed.
I got asked that question in marriage counseling. I failed that question. I like 50-50. Heard that one? Nope. So yes, you're right. You're right, Beth.
Brandon, the world, more or less, and not just the world, but I think some of us as parents have taught our kids, or we've been taught that you got to stand up for yourself if somebody mistreats you, or if you're picked on, or you're, whatever, you got to stand up for yourself. Well, that's not really the model of love. You love everybody unconditionally, whether or not they're treating you correctly. But we've been ingrained and taught and led by examples, I think, to be nice and love those who are loving us, and then people that are so-so, we're so-so towards them, and then people that are mean or ugly to us, then, we don't like them.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the model, not just of the world, but I think sometimes even us as Christians kind of can model that.
Sure. Well, I think you said the key word there is, like, what do we do to get something in return, right? We put conditions on it, right? So this love, this transaction in the marriage is going to work best if there are conditions, and those conditions are met, and it turns into a good bill of service, and things are traded and returned, and all of a sudden everything becomes a condition in there. So is the love that he talks about here, love your wives? Like, what kind of love are we talking about here? Is that?
You'd die for her.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. And specifically, what kind of love in the Bible? Agape love, right? Agape, unconditional love. Because if you go on, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, so we have an agape love here. And so he's telling us, love your wives, agape style, just as Christ loved the church. And so that's like a pretty big thing. So all of a sudden, all those conditions that I have within this marriage to love in a certain way, like all those are thrown out the window. And so all of a sudden, this feeling of love that I have is that's what it is. It's a feeling. The most important thing is that I fulfill love in such a way as Christ did, and so that is unconditional. And so that's also very risky as well. There's a lot of risk that comes with that too, because I think we would all agree that in this world today, there's probably a lot of people that are going to not love us back. And not specifically, I mean, unfortunately, sometimes in marriage, but ultimately in the world, we are not going to be received. And so, like, we are called, even in marriage, to do this, and it's telling us here specifically, husbands, to do this in agape style. And so, man, this is going really fast. This is a pretty big topic for 45 minutes. Okay, so jumping down, I'm just going to move through these a couple here quick. And so, verse 27, picking up, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain. Actually, let me go back. 26, to make her holy, cleansing her by washing with the water through the word. 27, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without sin, stain, or wrinkle, or any blemish, but holy and blameless. Whew. That's pretty big. Again, though, so we're relating this to the church, right? And so as I look at this and you look at my duties to help create a household where we are those things, it's obviously, it's like I said, it's a two-way street here. But I have to ask myself, and men, I think we have to ask ourselves too, is this where we're relating to the scripture here? Is my wife more like Christ because she is married to me? Or is she like Christ in spite of me? Has she shrunk from his likeness because of me? Do I sanctify her or hold her back? Is she a better woman because she's married to me? Is she a better friend, a better mother? I read some of that stuff, and I'm like, wow, so this is what I am called to do for our household. So definitely some heavy stuff within that verse. Okay, so down to 28. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. 29. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body just as Christ does for the church. So when he talks about loving our wives as we love our own bodies, where do you go with that? Where do you go with whenever, it's treat your neighbor as yourself, love your wife as you love your own body? Where do you think that maybe in that way of thinking of how we mess that up a little bit, how does one maybe get to a point where they skew that a little bit? Or where do we fall apart on that a little bit? Okay, so not a great question. I get that. But what I was wanting to go see if anybody maybe could pick out of the air of where I was going with that. But what I was thinking is a lot of times whenever I read this verse and I say, yes, I am to love her as I love myself, that means I take an inventory of my own self and I see how much I am worth, and then I value her worth off of how much I value my worth. It's kind of a weird kind of connection point that I make, but the way that I am judging value and evaluating it is pretty skewed. And so I think Paul is saying that we should love our wives as part of our own body. And men should love their wives because they are their own body. When two become one, they become one flesh. And so I am to love her as I love my own body. And that's how I see verse 28. Okay, so I want to jump. So we saw some stuff with husbands in there, what we are to do. Some of it's daunting, and especially whenever we are comparing it to how Christ loved the church and died for the church, we are to do the same sacrificially. But if we jump back up to remember I said this isn't just a guy's thing. It starts off in 21, submit to one another in the reverence of Christ. And then he goes into wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do for the Lord. So 22, submission is based on being as to the Lord. In other words, submission is not based on the character or performance of the other individual. Instead, there is an unconditional treatment of the husband based on love for him and for God. Wives are to show love to their husbands regardless of whether they feel the husband deserves it. Because if we are to love as Christ loves the church, I think the agape love of Christ, that falls into that pretty good too, for wives as well. So I think we've seen a theme develop here just a little bit, right? It's not one that's new. It's just one that I need a lot of reminding on the agape love. So let's do this just real quick. Let me go to my last page out of order here. So I think if we really want to go back to where this all was wrong, we're going back to the garden, all right, just real quick. So this is where our rebellion started. Our spiritual citizenship rebellion started too. And so God creates, of course, the free will and the incompleteness that it gives us. And so this is a question I kind of always wondered a little bit. So we know the creation story and the story of deceit. And so starting in Genesis 2:22, they're married. And then before that, he gives Adam instructions. You're not to eat of this tree. So Adam knows he's not supposed to. He wasn't deceived in this way, we're told. And then he sees that he needs a helper, a suitable helper, as we're told. And so he creates Eve out of the rib. And so I'm going to try to give a little medical stuff here. I've got a doctor over here. Just nod your head and act like I'm right on it. I was nervous when you try to give some type of specific pro knowledge on something. Actually, a guy is sitting there who actually knows what this is. So ribs have the ability to grow back as long as the perichondrion is not damaged. Is that right? Yeah. He balked, and so that means we're going with it. But I'm just kidding. But I read it. I read on the internet, so we're good. Exactly. But I mean, if it is, I think it's I love when God gives those moments where we validate something like that. Of my dad has liver cancer, and before we got to the point where he couldn't have it operated on, it was we can just cut half the liver in half and it'll grow back. We're like, what? Really? That's amazing. And so the rib, in the same way, I think it's cool whenever we're given these moments that we have developed, we have learned that these things are, reveal God to us, that they just, amaze us whenever, he did it, all from the beginning. And this is one of those. So he makes her from the rib. And so we get to the point where Satan is there, and the Satan is there. And he deceives, and of course we know what happens from there. This is kind of just a curious question. Why did God not just create Adam and Eve at the same time like other creatures?
I think Adam had to be taught a lesson of he needed Eve.
Yeah.
When he looked at all the other animals, he saw that, and he was naming them, he realized that there wasn't a counterpart to him.
Yeah.
So it was a need that he had.
Incompleteness.
Yeah, incompleteness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're right. I mean, that's pretty much it. But the second thing I always wondered was why do we think that Satan approached Eve first? I know, now that I see everybody looking at me, I'm like, that was stupid. I mean, discuss that amongst yourselves, type of thing. Go chew on that at home. But maybe it brings up this. What are, and maybe this is just in relation to maybe how we can have better marriages and maybe how those can spread throughout our followership and being disciples. What are some main characteristics of men and women as far as differences and how maybe those complement each other in our marriages? Yeah. 4 minutes. Let's.
Nurturer versus conqueror.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Feeling versus understanding.
Okay, feeling versus understanding.
Logical versus practical.
Yeah, logical versus practical. Okay.
We get slapped later.
Are we getting up to that line? Like we're getting closer and closer.
It's all good.
That's right. We're a family, right?
Well, you mentioned complimenting. You need logic at times and you need emotion at times, and most decisions you need both.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's where the complementary comes in.
Mm-hmm.
I was watching a video by Jordan Peterson. How do
Right.
you guys know who he is?
Mhm.
He's like anyway, he was talking about how on the scale of men and women, the most disagreeable people tend to be men and the most agreeable people tend to be women. Even if 95% of the graph we're very similar.
Yeah.
If you come across a disagreeable person, you're more likely to be a man. And if you come across a more agreeable person, you're more likely to be a woman. And so maybe
I agree with that.
Well said.
We just learned a lot about Larry.
We did. Oh, that's good. Yeah, no comment. All right, so to that point, I think Satan had studied them, right? I don't think he just cast out and he was hanging out. He's like, oh, look at these guys. I'm about to go try to see if I can trick them. I mean, being the ultimate deceiver, he kind of knew their tendencies, right?
We have no record that he did approach the
That's-
guy first.
Yeah,
Could have, and he could have been shut down.
that's true.
It's a possibility.
Sure. The point is, we don't.
We don't know.
Yeah, we don't know, right? But he sees them and he thinks, I think I could get a 2-for-1 out of this deal. Like in sports and basketball, it is, you try to get 2 possessions at the end of the half or the quarter, trying to basically get more points. He's in that situation here. And so I always wondered, do you think he could have got to Eve through Adam? I don't know. There's just points I was pondering last night. I don't know. The point is, I always thought it was in the story that, I don't know why I think this, that Eve, being the independent thinker here, one who obviously was better, probably because of women are at this, better relationally, probably better at listening, but still had that spirit of, when presented with some rebellion, just like men, took it. And then Adam was the guy who preferred, I don't want necessarily something too hard, what you got for me, and I ultimately prefer that and you over this eternal life with God here in the garden. That's how I have seen that. Anyways, maybe not, I don't know, but that's why I've kind of gone, and that's why in this talk about us and our relationships with one another in marriage and our relationship with the church, I think all those things don't really necessarily matter as much, except to the point that I think that we are forgetting about the agape love of things, and that it's a tough, tricky thing, like I said, because it's voluntary. But if we go at this in such a way where we are doing it as such where Christ loved and died for the church, then that love has the ability to do great things for us in our marriage. And I kind of hastily wrapped that up, but it's past time, and I have to get a kid as well. So, yes?
I just think it's very curious that Jeff chose this week to be gone.
Man, no doubt.
That's all I keep thinking.
Y'all tell him about that.
He just left you on your own.
I gave it the old college try, my best. So, no, he left me up here. So anyways, thank you guys so much. Before we go, we're going to go old school Oakdale style today. If you weren't over at the church building, you got to see about what Oakdale Church was about every Sunday. So, because tonight we're doing our singing in here, it's going to be more like a round style. And so we're going to stack chairs just like we did back in the day across the street at the school building. So I think we're going to do, we only have 2 of them. That's going to be problematic. I think we can get 10, maybe a dozen on each one of these. And then I guess after that, let's just start, how many rows? Just stack them where they are. Oh, that's right. That's how we used to do it. Thanks. So just stack them up in stacks of 10, right? That's how it was. Where they are in stacks of 10, and that would be a big help. So thank you guys so much.